Um, Hi, thanks for coming out on this nice day. I'm Dan Slater, Director of Center for Emerging Democracies. And today, our last event of the academic year. So we've got a book talk recently published book by Kai Thaler here from the University of California at Santa Barbara from their Department of Global Studies. And I had the real pleasure just a couple of weeks ago of actually being out at UCSB for his book launch there, which was a great event. And so Kai's a real friend of the center. He's been here on multiple occasions for different occasions. He co-edited one of our issues of Democracy and Autocracy, one of our newsletters. So it's really delightful to be able to have him here, and it's a real occasion for this book to come together. It's a really wonderful book. And as is our norm, we have a respondent for the book. So very happy that Justine Davis is with us as well. So she'll be the respondent to Kai's book. She's Justine, you know Justine. Justine she's in the Department of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies, or DAS, here at the University of Michigan. So I'm gonna turn things over to Kai for his book talk. Justine will respond, and after that, assuming that doesn't lead to any fisticuffs, we'll go directly into Q&A from there. So without further ado, Professor Thaler.
Thank you, sir. All right. So thank you very much, Dan, for the introduction and having me here. Thanks to Dina and Rosa for helping set up the visit. Thank you in advance to Justine. I'll thank you now. I may be crying later for the comments. And yeah, thank you all for coming out today. So this book, When Rebels Win, came out in December from Cornell University Press. It was a long time in the making for any grad students in the room. This did come out of my dissertation. I took longer than some people to turn it into a book. I'd like to say that made it a better book in the end, gave me more time to think about things and allow world events to make rebel victory a more relevant topic for policy issues. Other people would say I was distracted and focusing on too many other things. So this project is part of my broader focus on ideas and actors' agency and how they shape decision-making, institutions, state building during and after conflicts, and kind of interactions transnationally and locally. So the core questions of this book are: how do rebels rule when they win? Why does that vary? And how is variation in forms of rule after rebel victory shaped by factors from their time fighting against the state? You know, these groups have developed in order to fight the government. They managed to take power, control an internationally recognized state. Now you are the incumbent. You have to figure out how you're going to use this state. How are you going to rebuild it or build new institutions, reorient things based on what you said you were going to do during the war or adapting afterwards? And one way to think about this is through these contrasting experiences of rebel victory in Nicaragua and Liberia that a couple of my interlocutors talked with me about when I was conducting fieldwork. So Elvira Quadra became a security researcher working for a think tank in Nicaragua, but during the revolutionary period in the 1980s, after the Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the FSLN, after their victory, she was a young student who went out from the city, from the capital region of Managua, to the countryside as part of literacy brigades for a state literacy campaign to try to help more people learn to read and write. And she talked about how in Nicaragua, war tore the social fabric, but it also, in this period after rebel victory, created a situation where new institutions, new organizations could be developed in a way that hadn't been possible and hadn't been present in the country beforehand. By contrast, in Liberia, after the victory of the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or NPFL, Hassan Bility, who was a journalist and then became a human rights advocate, told me that there was not much social policy when the NPFL took over the state. Everything was about security, and especially securing the personal economic interests of Charles Taylor, the main leader of the NPFL, who became president of Liberia, other leaders in the NPFL, and their cronies. So these were very different types of states that were set up. So rebel victory is not the most common Civil War outcome, but it's not so uncommon. Since 1945, rebels have taken control of an internationally recognized state after about 1/4 of civil wars, whether that means taking over an existing central state or successfully seceding and achieving international recognition. In these cases, what explains variation in how rebel victors approach state building and governance more generally? Do they seek a more limited state that they're trying to build or rebuild? See this in cases like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Liberia. Or are they seeking a more extensive state with broader influence throughout society and across the national territory? We see this in cases like Cuba, Vietnam, Rwanda. So what explains these different approaches to the state? I argue that ideology holds the answer to this. In the book, in the first part, I am kind of introducing the question or problem, laying out my argument about how groups' ideological orientation, which I'll get into a little more in a second, shapes their state building intentions, their governing behavior while they're fighting as rebels, and then after they control the state. The empirical core of the book is these 3 case chapters on the FSLN in Nicaragua, the NPFL in Liberia, and the National Resistance Movement, or NRM, in Uganda. These are cases where I conduct field work. And then I extend out from there to other cases. I look at anti-colonial rebellions in Angola during the 1960s and 1970s as a way to test whether ideology and rebel groups' ideologies are overdetermined by their structural context. So this is looking at 3 nationalist rebel groups all fighting against the Portuguese colonial authorities around the same time that developed quite different ideologies and different orientations in terms of what they wanted the state to do and who they wanted it to serve. And then to try to have a little more contemporary policy relevance, I look at cases of Islamist victory. There hadn't been all that many. Over the course of my writing the book, we got a couple more in Afghanistan Part 2 and Syria. So I look back historically at the FLN in Algeria, which was a group who had sort of a combination nationalist and, to an extent, Islamist ideology. I look at the revolutionary regime in Iran. We can talk a little more about whether that should be considered a rebel victory or not. And then at the Taliban in the 1990s, and then after 2021. So jumping to the argument, I argue that an organization's ideology developed while they're fighting as rebels is going to shape the type and probability of state building efforts they engage in once they are in control of the state. And I say state building efforts, not outcomes, because state building is an extremely difficult task to achieve in any post-conflict context, whether it's after a rebel victory, after a negotiated settlement, or when governments themselves win. Civil wars can be very destructive. There are varying levels of resources available after civil wars. So whether or not you achieve something, I think effort helps us understand a group's intentions, what they're trying to do, whether it comes to fruition or not. And I'm defining ideology in line with other work on civil wars, looking at it as a relatively clear, coherent set of beliefs that are defining a constituency, so defining who a group is fighting for and what goals should be pursued in its interests, and what actions should be undertaken toward that. How does a group develop an ideology? I argue that the leadership sets the core ideological agenda. Leadership can evolve. Ideology initially in a group may be contested among different factions who are vying for control, who are vying for ideological hegemony within the organization. But once that is settled and there's a clear ideological direction, I argue that this orients the group not just during its time fighting against the state, but also through its first decade in power. Why cut it off after the first decade? Well, over time, ideology can wane in terms of people's adherence. It may start to evolve more. You can have domestic or international shocks. A leader could die. You could have a global crisis of some sort. And this may lead to some reorientation, but in the first decade after a victory, I think a lot of a group's ideas and their relationships with their followers are going to be much more baked in. A group has mobilized people, it's told them what they're fighting for and what they're going to do once they come into power. So there's some degree of both vertical accountability with followers and horizontal accountability among leadership, likely. So this process from ideology formation then leads to how people are socialized in the group, how people might be indoctrinated and trained. That shapes wartime policies and actions around how groups are, say, treating civilians, what types of rebel governance they're engaging in, and then leads to the way they govern once in power. We'll look at this a little bit in the FSLN case, just to see how the sequence might go. In 1969, these ideas had already been sort of developing within the group, but in 1969, they draw them all together in what was known as the Programa Histórico, the historical program, laying out the group's core ideas, what they were fighting for, what they wanted a state to do after they toppled the Somoza dictatorship. And these ideas continued orienting the group over the next decade until they finally take power in 1979. There was indoctrination and socialization of fighters and followers within the group. People had long political education sessions. Uptake always varies to an extent, what followers understand or internalize versus what leaders are trying to tell them can vary, but a lot of people really did buy into this. And it shaped the group's practices, their wartime policies and actions. The FSLN didn't control much territory while they were rebelling until the last couple of years of the war, but where they had some territorial presence or influence, they were having literacy lessons for people in remote peasant areas where there'd been little state presence or educational access before. In urban areas, they were organizing communities to try to deliver services and help people where the government was not serving them. And then this shaped how they used the state and how they built out its power after victory. This was the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment, Marena. This is actually a post of the ministry on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, at that point called the Costa Atlantica, Atlantic coast. um, accurately or inaccurately, depending on how you think about seas and oceans meeting up. But Marina and the rest of the state had not had much presence on the Caribbean coast before. The Frente Sandinista decided we want to extend the state out here, and they put a lot of effort into making it happen. So in trying to code organizations as having one type of ideology or another, I want to look at their discourse, at what they say, how are they expressing their ideals and goals, what policies are they proposing, but also at what they do in practice. We want to ensure that this isn't cheap talk. So sometimes people measure ideology just by groups' discourse. Most rebel groups are going to say, we're fighting for the people. We're fighting for democracy. There's going to be freedom and justice when we take power. You just all have to back us and believe us. They don't always mean that. So you have to look at how they're investing resources while they are fighting against the state. How are they organizing the group? What are fighters being socialized with and about? How are people being disciplined if they violate the group's supposed rules? And what are relations with civilians? Are they pretty top down, where the group and its military authorities are just telling people what to do? Or are they trying to incorporate populations into governance directly or indirectly? So to avoid selecting on the dependent variable, I am measuring this during the period fighting as rebels, rather than just looking at it after groups take power. What do we mean by state power? To think about this, I draw on the work of the sociologist Michael Mann, who delineates despotic and infrastructural power. Despotic power is the ability for elites to impose their will on the population. Infrastructural power entails the ability to work with and through civil society and across territory to try to achieve elite goals without resorting to coercion. And so I focus especially on the coercive element of despotic power. All rebel groups want to develop coercive power. They need to fight against the state. They want to have some coercive power after they take over the state to defend themselves. Not all groups want infrastructural power. They don't necessarily care about working with and through the population. They don't necessarily care about having much of a state presence beyond we've taken over the capital, maybe we control some resource-rich areas. I argue, though, that if you want to transform society, if your goals are for seriously changing how things are organized and run in a country, you need infrastructural power to do that. You can try to coerce people into submission, but that's difficult, that's costly. It is, in many ways, a lot easier if you can mobilize at least some of the population towards your aims. And there's another dimension of how groups are governing. Some seek to inclusively benefit a broad population, and others are more exclusive. They only want to benefit group leaders or a narrow swath of society, whether that's economic elites or a particular ethnic community within the country. So we have, it's a 2x2, but on different axes here, because I think there's a continuum. Groups can be more what I call programmatic or opportunistic, depending on their degree of societal change they desire. Opportunistic groups are generally okay with society as it is. They want to change more who is in power and who is able to benefit from the state. More programmatic groups want to transform the state and society. And the other Let's hear the y-axis is the proportion of the population that groups intend to benefit if they manage to take power. Are they more inclusive or more exclusive in that proportion of the population? So you wind up with four ideal types: opportunistic-inclusive, programmatic-inclusive, programmatic-exclusive, and opportunistic-exclusive. In the book, I talk about how most rebel victors wind up along this diagonal from opportunistic-exclusive to programmatic-inclusive. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A a little bit more about these other quadrants, opportunistic-inclusive and programmatic-exclusive, and who might fall into those. So with the core case studies in the book, I look at these three victories: the FSLN in Nicaragua, the NRM in Uganda, and NPFL in Liberia. These are in different parts of the world: in Central America, in East Africa, in West Africa. They take place at different times: 1979 in Nicaragua, 1986 in Uganda, around 1996-97 in Liberia. But these rebel groups all began fighting in, I argue, relatively similar structural circumstances. They were fighting against patrimonial dictatorships that were relatively exclusive in countries that were among the poorest in their regions, in countries that had long histories of foreign involvement or influence by regional or global hegemons. So, happy to talk a little more about why I selected these cases in the Q&A. But these groups, which start in somewhat similar structural circumstances, wind up developing very different ideologies, and that leads them down very different paths as rebels and once they're in power. Given the time, I'm going to focus on the more extreme ends of the spectrum, opportunistic-exclusive and programmatic-inclusive, and can talk more later about the NRM in Uganda, who are more in the middle ground. And so I'll zoom in now to the FSLN case in Nicaragua and the NPFL in Liberia. And these case studies across the three cases are based on 16 months of fieldwork, interviews with 127 participants, former rebel elites and military and political officials, other government officials who came in afterwards, civil society members, journalists, NGO workers, activists, community leaders, and some of these groups' opponents as well. Also research in 8 archives and libraries across these different countries. There was a different balance in terms of the data collection and sources in each place, depending a bit on people's willingness to talk, somewhat the timing of when I was there, and also the availability of the documentary record. So I did more interviews in Liberia. There's a thinner documentary record, more of a mix in Nicaragua, and primarily had to rely on the archives in Uganda. Even though we're able to be there at different times, people might have been more willing to talk. So the FSLN in Nicaragua were organized around an ideology of Sandinismo, which combined Marxism-Leninism, an anti-imperialist, especially anti-US imperialist nationalism, and also elements of Catholic liberation theology. So it's this syncretic ideology. I would say the Marxist-Leninist and nationalist components have a little bit greater weight, but especially among one set of the group, liberation theology was really key. And they had very long-term goals of transforming the state and society. As Hugo Torres, who was a guerrilla leader and then a general after the revolutionary victory, said, this was not an armed group fighting only to take power, but to advance the interests of the people and working class in general. So it was inclusive. Maybe some national elites associated with the ruling Somoza family were going to be on the outs, but for the most part, they wanted to serve the population at large. And they wanted to transform society, which required building out the state. Judy Butler was a journalist who worked a lot on the Caribbean coast during the 1980s, said past a certain point, there was no state. So the idea of bringing healthcare and schools, elevating people's well-being, their political inclusion in these regions was a necessary part of what the FSLN wanted to do. And they tried to put this into practice and to instill these ideas in people while they were rebelling. They really emphasized political education, both for fighters and followers more generally. And part of this political education was based around getting people to internalize these long-term goals of benefiting a broad population beyond the organization itself. Javier Pichardo, who was a guerrilla commander, in an interview that someone else conducted, said, we had the idea that we would die along the way. We knew the people would triumph, but that we would not see it. Javier Pichardo actually did see the rebel victory in this case. And as I mentioned before, the FSLN had very limited territorial gains during this period where they were fighting against the state until the last couple of years, but they still engaged in these governance efforts, having literacy lessons, trying to organize communities in areas where they had some degree of influence. In Liberia, it's a different story. The NPFL develops out of some of the remnants of a failed coup attempt against the government of Samuel Doe, who himself had come to power, a military coup. And during the 1980s, there's this period where a bunch of different opposition leaders are trying to become the figureheads of opposition to Doe and trying to organize armed resistance, traveling around West Africa, going to Libya to train. And eventually, one person winds up in pole position, and it's Charles Taylor here, who was educated in the US, briefly went to jail in Massachusetts, and then escaped, he claims, with a degree of CIA help or knowledge. That remains a bit disputed, but Taylor manages to consolidate agenda-setting power within the NPFL, and he does this really by pushing out anyone who disagrees with him, either freezing them out of the group, expelling them, or outright killing them. Prince Johnson, who was an early military leader in the NPFL, he actually led the group who first invaded Liberia in 1989. He told me that he left the NPFL in 1990 to start his own faction, the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, or INPFL, because Taylor was overambitious for power. He said Charles Taylor wanted a dictatorship. He didn't want democracy. He just wanted power for himself. And Johnson wanted elections and democracy in Liberia after pushing out Doe. Prince Johnson, for anyone who knows a bit about him, might not seem like the most reliable narrator. The time I was talking to him, he was a senator. He was a particularly powerful senator in Liberia. He was from Nimba County, one of the most populous counties outside of Montserrado, where the capital is. And Johnson and the INPFL during the 1990s were notorious for their brutality. Johnson was videotaped torturing and killing former President Doe. By the time I was speaking to him in 2015, he's a senator. He says he's found God. He's trying to promote this image of himself as a Democrat. So maybe he's just trying to pull the wool over my eyes about this whole, oh, I left because of democracy thing. Other interviewees confirmed this, and it turned out that in 1991, Johnson actually published a book in Nigeria called The Gun That Liberates Should Not Also Rule. So he, at least at the time, believed this or was telling people this as well, that this split happened because Thaler wanted power for himself. And after a certain point, after purges, after killings of potential alternative leaders, there was no NPFL but Charles Thaler. The group was organized around seeking what he wanted, and what he wanted was power for himself and economic benefits. There was little other political program or political education. There was little idea for what to do with the state after victory, other than possibly, as a former NPFL official, John T. Richardson said, running Liberia as a corporate entity. And this would be an entity where the profits would flow to Thaler and other NPFL leaders. The group had a fair amount of territorial control. At times, they controlled 90% of Liberia's territory. Their control generally remained somewhere above 50% for most of the war, but they engaged in very predatory governance. They were using the population for labor, for economic extraction, but with little real governance to benefit the population, deliver services. They establish this shadow government in the city of Banga. It has officially ministries and institutions that mirror the Liberian state, but this is a facade. It's designed to say to the international community, hey, we can govern, we can set up a state like Liberia's had, but there's not really any investment in this supposed government. What they were doing was extracting revenues. This is a contract for protection with the Firestone Rubber Corporation, which operates still a large rubber plantation in Liberia. It is one of the stranger places I've ever been. And at this time, Firestone wanted to keep producing rubber. The NPFL and Charles Thaler wanted money. And so they signed this contract with the NPRAG, which was the shadow government. And the group had between $6 million and $22 million US in revenue annually. Those are probably low estimates to an extent, but really developed little administration. But what happens after victory in Nicaragua? The Sandinistas do try to put these principles of transforming the state into action, building out state institutions, building out influence across the country, and mobilizing the population for it. And one of the places where this is clearest is their agrarian reform efforts. So Nicaragua at this time is a primarily agrarian country. Land was greatly concentrated among a wealthy elite and people tied to the formerly ruling Somoza dictatorship. The Sandinistas come in and say, we want to redistribute land. They wanted to give some directly to peasants. They wanted to create agricultural collectives as well. And they built up peasant associations to try to do this. So they're mobilizing the population. They're also building out administrative capacity around the country. In order to achieve this, you need cadastral surveys. You need to know who technically owns certain land, which peasants have been cultivating it, how to try to redistribute things. So Jaime Wheelock, who was a Sandinista commander and became the Minister of Agrarian Reform, he said this ministry had a deployment in all departments, all of the municipalities, so spread throughout the territory, and was well resourced. They were investing in this ministry and in this effort. They had trucks, they had personnel, they were given the resources to develop collective enterprises. So the Sandinistas were putting their money where their mouth was on this. And they were continuing to do this even as a rebellion was brewing up against them by the Contra forces in the 1980s. And throughout the agrarian reform efforts and other governance efforts, the Sandinistas were trying to build up influence through civil society and use the population to achieve their goals. They developed different sectoral organizations, unions, peasant groups, and identity-based organizations for youths, for women, for indigenous and Afro-descendant populations. This is a women's organization poster from Amanlai, which was the women's organization. And this was around their participation in a literacy campaign. They also had these Comités de Defensa Sandinista, or CDSs, Sandinista Defense Committees. These were throughout the country, in municipalities and neighborhoods. They were in part used to develop infrastructural power to build state influence. They were used in vaccination drives to mobilize communities for cleanup efforts. They also had a surveillance function as well to have people keeping an eye out for subversive activity. So they helped spread some of the coercive power as well. The NPFL and the state they developed or did not develop so much after victory had a much more limited territorial reach and little non-coercive influence. Some people who had joined the NPFL had believed some of the rhetoric about what the group was going to do if they came to power. Oh, there is going to be freedom. Oh, we are, going to be able to get jobs to benefit from the state. One early officer said we were expecting that to happen, to build roads and schools and things, but it didn't happen that way. Charles Taylor didn't sit down with plans to do that, just for war. And the NPFL government both engaged in war with rebels who took up arms against them within the country, and also tried to build out rebellions around the region, sending out NPFL leaders and giving funding and arms to rebel groups around West Africa to try to establish what Taylor discussed as a greater Liberia, where he would also be able to benefit from the timber and diamonds and other minerals in Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, and elsewhere. The supposed public budget didn't really matter. Resources were instead being shifted towards secret bank accounts benefiting Taylor and other NPFL leaders and cronies. Nat Barnes, who was a finance minister. Taylor cycled through a few finance ministers during his time as president. Barnes told me Taylor would come in and say, I need $500,000 immediately, or for whatever Taylor wanted, probably to shift to some account or pay someone off. And Nat Barnes would lie and say, oh, sorry, I already, moved that money earlier to pay for a project or pay public employee salaries. And then he would go and do it. So, those officials who did have some other idea for what the state should be doing had to use subterfuge to try to do it, because that was not the government's priority. I have run myself short on time again, so I'm going to rush through and can talk about this more in Q&A, but folks from the Ford School and elsewhere might be kind of saying, well, what about a little more of the practical side of governance and service provision? To look at that, in my cases, I also look at healthcare and education. And broadly, we see these patterns of state building and inclusion in the FSLN case and little investment and exclusion in the NPFL case. The Sandinistas really worked hard to build out access to health infrastructure, vaccination campaigns, spreading healthcare provision around the country. In Liberia, not really any investment in that. Same story for education. The Sandinistas have this major literacy campaign. They're trying to increase access to schooling. In Liberia, the NPFL is largely neglecting education, leaving it to donors and private provision. Zooming out a little bit, so what are some of the implications of this project more broadly? One is that victory by some rebels can lead to stronger, more publicly oriented states. A lot of work would suggest that civil wars destroy state capacity. And some of the work more on interstate war says, well, war can help build the state. This is the Charles Tilly bellicist state building idea. There's been debates about how much that idea travels beyond Europe, how much it matters in Africa and Latin America. But specifically for cases of rebel victory, I show how victory by certain rebel groups, if they have a transformative ideology, can lead to a new government that wants to engage in state building. That state capacity, though, is value neutral. People may disagree with how it's used. Groups can use it towards ends that we might find normatively pretty distasteful. The Taliban built out infrastructural power and have used it to oppress women, even while they claim they're acting in women's interests. And on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas build out state capacity, are going to be providing education, a lot of the indigenous and Afro-descendant populations there weren't very happy about this. They felt like it was interfering with their lifeways, with connections to the land, with the forms of education that they were receiving through the Moravian Church, which was very active there. And they weren't really very happy about this. Over time, some Sandinista leaders start to realize they screwed up and were overly imposing themselves. But for the FSLN, initially, they're thinking, we're doing this for the benefit of these people who have not received any benefits from the state before. Longer term, even for these more programmatic and inclusive groups, power may corrupt them. They may start out with these aims and actually engaging in practices to benefit a broader population, and over time, just focus more on maintaining power and benefits for elites. We see this in all sorts of settings, in some of the places that Dan and I are looking in our work on left-wing authoritarian regimes. This is an unfortunately common pathway. More generally, close attention to rebel groups' ideology can be really helpful for international actors who are trying to plan and respond to rebellion and cases of rebel victory. Looking at groups' ideologies helps us understand what sorts of proposals or what sorts of aid provision may be possible or acceptable for groups when you're trying to engage with them. So to give an example from Afghanistan, which, as I mentioned, is not the easiest context to work in to try to benefit women. UN Women has not really been able to do much when the Taliban has been in power. But if you are at the UN, UNDP can still try to engage in programs that are going to benefit the population more broadly, or are at least presented as being geared toward that, but ones that they know will have real benefits for women. Things around improving access to water, a task that women are often forced to engage in, going and gathering water. If you can make it more accessible, you can potentially make women's lives a bit easier, even if you can't necessarily pitch it as that. Ideology also influences what incentives or pressure will or won't work when you're trying to shape a group's behavior once they're in power. Certain things may be non-negotiable, others groups may be willing to shift. And so looking at their ideology can help you determine that. If you are an international actor trying to shape groups' behavior, though, it may be difficult. Domestic sources of post-conflict reconstruction, in these cases of rebel victory, can be, very different from Western liberal models of state building. Groups may try to twist international aid towards their own ends, and international actors often have a really hard time getting groups to comply, even in seemingly easy cases. Outside of this, we see enduring authoritarian regimes today generated by rebel victory, especially in Africa and Asia. In the Americas, we still have Cuba holding on. And in many of these cases, groups engaged in some economic liberalization to try to help retain power after the Cold War. They may have started holding elections, but never achieved full democracy. See this in places like Angola and Mozambique, where you have a bit more opening in the 1990s and early 2000s, potentially, and then greater closure today after recent elections. Cuba and Iran, products of these sorts of victories, have had very entrenched regimes and enduring geopolitical rivalries. And for this kind of early period, for these international efforts to try to shape what groups are doing, a final implication is that the early period after rebel victory may be when international engagement is most impactful. This is when groups have kind of the most tenuous hold on power. Over time, they're likely to be able to eliminate alternative domestic power centers, to blunt international pressures more. And you can see how difficult it's been for international actors to try to coercively shape Taliban behavior after 2021, how little that's really done. And international actors have started to re-engage with the Taliban now, accepting that they're in power. On the flip side, some governments seem to have maybe learned from that a bit when they've been dealing with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria. I'll finish up there and turn it over to Justine. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for kind of summarizing this book for us, so I don't have to do the summary thing, which is great. So this book offers like a very clear theory, which I appreciated, that links wartime organizational characteristics of rebel movements to post-war governance in a robust and compelling way through rich, detailed case studies, where I was more familiar with the Liberia and Uganda case, and yet I still learned a ton. I knew very little about Nicaragua, so I learned a lot about that as well. And then you have a whole chapter about Angola, which, again, I knew much less about, but a little bit. And so I've learned a ton from these really rich case studies. I'm currently teaching an undergrad class on political violence in Africa. Some of my students are here. And one of the things we just talked about rebel governance in class, and one of the overarching questions that students have is what happens after wars end. And so your book pushes against contemporary media portrayals of rebels as all rebels are predatory and chaotic, and what happens after civil war is just like devastation and chaos, by offering us an argument about ideological commitment, but it goes farther to answer the question my students often ask about what happens next. So that this is my compliment sandwich. That was the compliment red part. So I want to group my comments around 2 points. So the first is about the theory, as well as kind of generalizability, so rebel victory and more contemporary civil conflicts. And then the second is about method and research design. So regarding rebel victory, I think you do a really great job of foregrounding rival explanations in the intro and then kind of tackling them one by one through the book, which was very convincing and great. But there's a couple of things that I think are not addressed quite enough. And the first is about time. So you have this threshold of 6 months, like they need to have like battled against the state for 6 months. But that's the only kind of threshold that you have. And I kept thinking about like the duration of the Civil War and how that shapes the ability of a programmatic set of ideology to emerge, right? Because if you fight for 1 year versus if you fight 20 years, that's going to make a big difference as to how your mechanism kind of works when it is linked through socialization, right? Like it takes time to socialize people. At the same time, you could also imagine that like in the first few years of fighting, maybe they're really programmatic. They're like, we're gonna change this country. And then as time progresses, they become more predatory or they want to they are able to kind of build their extractive capacity. And so then they become more predatory. And so time wasn't something that you kind of dealt with in the book concretely. The Angola case does kind of mitigate some of these concerns because you're kind of holding constant time. But it's still like, I kept thinking about the other cases or other kind of universe of cases and how the length of time that they're battling against the state might matter. The other question, so that's a theory question. The other question is about rebel victory itself. So it's becoming less of a thing, right? As we see, post-90s into the 2000s, the numbers of wars ending in negotiated settlements is kind of outpacing rebel or government victory, right? And this changes whether and how rebels or factions of rebels can govern. Many have to be integrated into the military, but not all of them, or into the government. Or, and you do say in the theory chapter that you do consider cases where the rebels came into power via elections, but that is also kind of assuming that they kind of forced elections as opposed to a peace agreement made them participate in elections. And there is this robust literature or new literature about rebel to political party transformations, but I think this is kind of a different question in which, we're thinking about like rebels joining the government and not the other way around, if that makes sense. And so how does this theory apply to context where, like the one I know best, Cote d'Ivoire, where there wasn't a rebel victory, but the rebel-supported candidate gets into power, right, in subsequent elections? How might we think about governance in that way, where it's kind of a mix of rebel leaders and non-rebel leaders kind of governing? Can the rebel movements, for example, kind of influence how these non-rebel leaders govern, and how does ideology play into that? And then this is being a bit unfair because you're not necessarily predicting the future, but I am curious about, along the same line, when thinking about how wars end today, what we might think about current civil conflicts. So Sudan, Central African Republic, South Sudan, how might we think about what is going to come next once those wars end, whether there's a rebel victory or a negotiated settlement? And so what does that look like? Along the lines of predicting the future, you did kind of highlight some of this about international support, but international interventions can facilitate rebel victory, right? But should we be intervening? I mean, this is a more broader question, but if we can think about the more programmatic rebels having better governance outcomes, in a world where we're trying to kind of manipulate what that looks like, wouldn't it make sense for the rebels to kind of pretend to be programmatic in order to get international support? If a rebel leader was reading your book, would they be like, oh, I just have to say I'm going to enhance education or infrastructure. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Shifting to methods and research design, in contemporary comparative politics, there's been a noticeable shift towards single country micro-level studies, a trend I appreciate because I participate in that approach. However, this shift has distanced us from the traditional emphasis on multi-country comparative studies. Your book clearly reconnects us with this valuable tradition and does so exceptionally well. One of the strengths of this book was how it not only compared several cases, but also provided rich data from other shadow cases to further test your argument. So it shows the breadth and depth of your argument, but also your field research skill and the commitment to getting the theory and argument correct. And so I wouldn't normally ask this, but one of the things that I kept thinking about the portability of your theory is how do all of the rebel victories map into your 2x2? You kind of allude to it in the book. So, for example, you kind of talk about how Rwanda would fit into that bottom right quadrant. But I wanted to kind of like see it all on there to be able to kind of think it through. And again, thinking about the Cote d'Ivoire case where you may not actually code it as rebel victory, but if we were, like, I was like, where would it fit? And so I wanted to see that. Now I recognize that deep fieldwork is really the only way to answer the question about ideology, especially because you go further than just what people say and you actually look at their programs. But I did kind of just want to see a distribution based on secondary sources of the rebel ideology types. And then finally, I teach a field research class related to field research for graduate students. Oh, there was one attendee in that class. And I appreciate that this book provides a great example of site-intensive methods, how to use interview data and interpret it to support an overarching argument. So it's a great example of that, but in a purely selfish way. I would have loved to see a discussion in the book about how inductive your theory was, how much the interviews, the archival work informed the way you were thinking about your cases and how they shaped the theory, because then I could assign that chapter too. And we read your paper about multi-method research in conflicts. We already have one Thaler piece on there, but being able to think harder and encourage the graduate students on how iterative and inductive the theory building process can be, especially with fieldwork, would have been really nice. And so I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine, for a pretty delicious compliment sandwich. The middle part, still very palatable. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to read the book and all of these really good questions and comments. So how much does the duration of the war affect what type of ideology a group might develop? And in a short war, is there just no chance for more programmatic ideology to really develop? Everyone's gotta mobilize quickly. So certainly the Jeremy Weinstein's explanation would be it's a lot quicker to if you have access to natural resources or foreign funding to mobilize people based on these material rewards or promises of them versus longer term rewards. One way that I think I could argue against that and don't really do in the book is that many rebel groups develop out of pre-existing political and social groups who already have some ideological basis or grounding or direction. And so even if you're only fighting for 6 months, the 6 months threshold was kind of designed to be able to have some sense of how groups put their rhetoric into practice. If it's shorter, there's not really much chance for any governance at all. And so my response would be, well, if you're coming out of a pre-existing political party, like many rebel groups do, or you have a strong basis among student organizations, these have a pre-existing politics. that they're able to build on and more rapidly develop a more comprehensive ideology and political vision that they're trying to socialize people into. You do get some groups evolving over time in their appeals or how they're presenting the ideology. In Liberia early on, many of the very first NPFL recruits, their military corps, were people who, like Prince Johnson, were a little more bought into this idea of democracy, and Thaler pushed a lot of those people out. In Sierra Leone, I think you see in the RUF, they never really seize power and fall in as a case of rebel victory, but there you do see a little more of Weinstein's crowding out mechanism, where there is a more of a political message and group initially, and then leaders see, oh, it's a lot quicker to recruit people using material promises and rewards. So it is in some ways, I would say, a political victory in Cote d'Ivoire. I'm drawing on Monica Toff's distinction between military victories, where you through direct force seize control of the state, and political victories, where in sort of the first elections or chance after a negotiated settlement, rebel actors manage to gain power. So the Force Nouvelle in Cote d'Ivoire, in my view, would be a case of rebel victory. There, as you very well know, there are divides within the group, and varying subnational control and strength. I think both your work, Phil Martin, Julia Piccolino, and Jeremy Spate's work all shows this very well. And this is a case where I don't know it quite as well, but I would probably put them more toward the middle ground of my axes there. And this also gets into the question of, well, why don't I have the table or the chart where the Force Nouvelle and this not huge number of rebel victories are out there? So you already got at part of the reason, which is that the way I want to measure ideology takes a lot of case knowledge and a lot of work to try to sift through what are groups saying, what are they actually doing. I have the language skills for some cases, not so much for others. I tried for a period during my postdoc to start building up a data set with a more fine-grained ideological coding for cases of rebel victory, and worked with a couple of grad students at the Corbell School in Denver on that. We got through some cases. After a little while, I still wasn't quite satisfied enough that we were fully getting fine-grained enough on the cases, and that it would really be worthwhile and useful for cross-national analysis. Other people disagree. If Megan Stewart is online, she was on a book panel at APSA, where I think she and Laia Balcells were both pushing me on this a little bit more. So maybe with some more support and resources, we could build it out. But this was that was kind of the reason why I didn't ultimately go with a more quantitative component, which I did think about during the dissertation and afterwards. And at a certain point, I also wanted to just get the book done versus a longer amount of data collection. And I felt pretty confident in the theory and the way I was demonstrating its potential generalizability through additional cases. In a world where programmatic rebels in programmatic-inclusive rebels, in my view, would offer better governance, and should get more international support. Would groups pander toward that? Certainly they could try, and this is why I think you need to look at practice and not just their rhetoric. Kim Howe and Dipali Mukhopadhyay have this book, Good Rebel Governance in Syria, and the ways that international actors like the US were trying to think about, okay, who are the good rebels in this very fragmented conflict? And when I was in grad school and it was the middle of the Syrian civil war, and before Russia had intervened very heavily, before ISIS had gotten quite so powerful, that was what I was thinking for my pitch of policy relevance. Like, okay, all these rebels fighting in Syria. We don't want Assad to stay in power. Don't want Islamic State to take over everything. How would you figure out who's going to govern best once they take power? This also gets into some of these difficult trade-offs of stability versus more democratic forms of governance. Often the most stable type of government after a civil war is a more authoritarian one. Most rebel victories result in an authoritarian government. Even when you have these political victories where it's a little more negotiation, the NPFL in Liberia governs in a very authoritarian way. In Cote d'Ivoire, there's certainly concerns about democratic erosion at this point. Nepal, with the Maoists, where it's also a political victory, you get a still some more democracy maintained, but it's pretty low quality, hence why the population rose up recently. So yeah, I try to be very cautious in how I talk about the policy implications and what people should do with this. And a big part of that is emphasizing this importance of case knowledge, contextual knowledge, to be able to sort through, who actually means what they're saying versus are engaging in cheap talk. And then, international actors have to make decisions based on what their own priorities are. Is it humanitarian relief? Is it post-conflict stability? Is it democracy? Those all may have very different groups you would choose to engage with, or in different ways. And one last thing, and I'll wrap up to give other people more space on the fieldwork and how much induction informed the theory, or as Torian Timmermans would call it, abduction, where you're moving back and forth between inductive and deductive. It was a deductive theory, developed with some knowledge of other cases. I came to this work having worked more on Angola and Mozambique beforehand. Angola's in the book. I didn't want to just continue working on those cases. I decided I didn't want to be just a Southern African liberation regime guy. There were already other great people doing it. So the turf was well staked out with good work. And so, when I started looking at my core cases in the book, most of the theory held. What I did refine, especially based on the FSLN case in Nicaragua, was this prior assumption I had that groups with more territorial control as rebels are going to be able to engage in more extensive state building after victory, because you have more opportunities for governance. So there's more opportunity to put ideology into practice. If you do want to engage in more extensive state building, you've got the experience there. You've shown the population you can do it, and the FSLN case really blew that up for me, because until late 1978 and into early 1979, when the Somoza regime is starting to break down, they have so little territorial control. You know, they've got urban guerrilla cells underground and a set of people off in the mountains, but they're really not controlling much territory. And yet, despite that, despite a lot of their leaders' lack of experience with government whatsoever, they engage in really extensive state building efforts with some degrees. Thanks so much for those questions.
Got about 15 minutes. We've already got one question online. I was about to say, not by Megan, but now she's about to ask a second one. But let's have some in person first. I know Anne, our expert on Southern liberation movements extraordinaire, is ready and raring with the questions. Let's go to Anne first.
Well, actually, the first revolutionary country I ever went to was Nicaragua. And I worked for OMLI there in 1983 when I was a college student. And I guess what I would say is that you could already see in 1983 the authoritarian elements of FSLN emerging. You know, it was the coercive power was pretty evident. But of course, the Contras were being financed by the U.S. already by then. So I guess while I, agree that you get some very different expressions of rebel ideologies by comparing Liberia and Nicaragua. Certainly it didn't last very long in Nicaragua, and they were already telling the FMLN from El Salvador, don't do what we did. Don't be as socialist in, outwardly socialist in your ideological motivation and in your objectives, because you will attract the attention of the US. And then if you flip it around and you look at Liberia, without the pressure of the Cold War as driver of some ideological choices by rebel groups, it seemed like that gave more power to donors to really push, in the Liberian case, to push for more democratic institutions. Now, that also, took a while, but it's interesting that today you look at Liberia and it's I think more democratic than Nicaragua.
Yeah, it was a big surprise for me, decade plus later from doing fieldwork in these countries. Liberia, for all of its problems and messiness, has a fairly stable and relatively healthy democracy, and is doing far better than Nicaragua and Uganda, where in both of them democracy has continued to erode as very personalist regimes under Ortega and Rosario Murillo in Nicaragua, and Museveni, and now potentially his son in Uganda, have really come to the fore. So in Nicaragua, as you say, there were authoritarian elements of the FSLN from pretty early on, and the group already had a kind of separate. There was the official, more pluralist governing junta when the revolutionary government came to power, that was not just FSLN leaders, but also incorporating some other civil society leaders who quickly realized where the true power lay with the Sandinista National Directorate. And so it, was a pretty party-driven political system, and actually then opens up a little more with elections in 1984 amid pretty strong US pressure, though the Sandinistas kind of were not actually going to turn over power if elections had gone against them then. But you do, despite this authoritarianism, still have a lot of buy-in to the ideology. There's very little corruption, and corruption was punished until 1990 when they lose elections. And it's interesting you mentioned, them telling the FMLN in El Salvador, don't be a socialist. This is what Fidel Castro was saying to Sandinista leaders before 1979, don't poke the eagle so much like I did, because it'll make it harder to rebuild your country. And there was more openness to somewhat cooperative relations with the US under Carter at first. And then when Reagan came in, that went out the door and kind of played into the FSLN leaders' distrust of the US. In Liberia, donors really tried when the NPFL came to power to put pressure on the government, and were generally ignored. Their NPFL followers will say like, oh, there wasn't any international help. There was significant international aid offered to the government, which refused to meet human rights conditions, and was redirecting aid to their own coffers. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I had a question about like the subnational application of these strategies. Like, did you see or have some sense of whether they were varying the way of applying like either the programmatic and the opportunistic strategies, like across cities or across like between rural and urban areas, or it was kind of like more or less pretty uniform, like at least in these extreme cases that you presented?
Yeah, so subnationally in Liberia, in part because urban areas had already had better access to services. A lot of the investment early on was in rural areas and marginalized urban neighborhoods. So you do see a concentration of investment in those places, but there was still a similar ideological aim across the country. This is one of the places where Shelley Liu and I disagree a bit, because her theory is based on loyalties of parts of the population or parts of the country during the rebellion period. The Sandinistas are trying to develop infrastructural power, build up the state, deliver services throughout the whole country. It didn't really matter, did people support them in this area before or not? Was there any state presence there before or not? And in the Liberian case too, a lot of the early supporters of the NPFL were from Nimba County, from a couple particular ethnic groups, and that was where the NPFL had more territorial presence during the war. They don't really invest in that region very much. Similarly in Uganda, the NRM are primarily based in the Luwero Triangle, where a lot of the war is fought, and they kind of promise rebuilding there doesn't really happen, but are also engaging in development projects around the country.
Thank you for the talk. I have a quick question. Do you think whether the rebel issues become more ideological or is tied to the tendency of the previous government that they fought against? Like if the previous government was more ideological than they will be, or the other way around? So you found a correlation like that?
So I think that's a really good question. I think most most of the time, rebel groups that manage to achieve victory have been fighting against an authoritarian regime of some sort, often a pretty exclusionary one. And so that's kind of going to condition a bit what they're, what you're fighting against will condition your ideology. You have to say why you're against the current government. You're going to have a hard time mobilizing a lot of people if you just say like everything's fine except the person in power. So put us in power and we'll be better than that guy, but you don't really express, what's going to change. So I think where a government with a strong, more programmatic, say, agenda has been in power, that can condition potentially whether a rebel group, is kind of happy maintaining the state that they built, or wants to be programmatic in a different direction and tear that down or repurpose it. So one of the kind of off my diagonal cases that I talk about a bit in the book as a programmatic-exclusive case is the nationalists under Franco in Spain after the Spanish Civil War. So they were fighting against a Republican government that incorporated socialists, that had challenged the power of the state, of the pre-existing state, but challenged the power of the Catholic Church, of large landholders and traditional elites, and had engaged in initial redistribution in areas like Catalonia. Anarchists had gained greater control, were engaging in more extensive redistribution. The nationalists wanted to take things back closer to the way they had been, but doing so required being programmatic and transforming, essentially reversing the state building that the Republican government had done. And they still really care about the education system and what content is in there. They care a lot about the state having influence through society, but they're exercising it in a different way and for the benefit of a narrower swath of the population.
So we've got a couple of online questions. That's probably about all we're going to have time for.
I'm happy to have further conversation afterwards with other folks in the room too.
It really is. You can definitely confront him afterwards. He'll appreciate that. But they both relate to institutions and organizations. So I want to try to kind of weave them together a little bit. So Ella Hadid is asking about how your theoretical framework deals with organizational cohesion. And it does strike me that it's not something you talk about very much, And so one possibility would be that one reason that, we see the state-building outcomes we have is sort of this ideology, but the mechanism could be that what an ideology provides is actually helps produce organizational cohesion. So, and that could speak maybe also to questions of success as well as just effort. And so whether or not, so how does, so this is riffing a little bit off his question here, because he's interested in how organizational cohesion relates to like authoritarianism after rebel victory. But I'd also be curious about how it relates to, is that part of the story of why we say what we do because of organizational cohesion in these rebel movements? And then Megan also asked about organizations, not surprisingly. And so Megan's question is about, so if you kind of what happens to institutions after the war? So if you have a programmatic group which governed in a programmatic way during the war, so it's building these wartime institutions, right? But then it faces pressure to change their ideology afterwards. Do you think they would be changing those pre-existing institutions, those wartime institutions, or would it only be kind of post change new institutions that would reflect those differences? And she's particularly thinking of of HTS in Syria. So a couple organizational questions you can kind of wrap up and do the best you can for those two.
Yeah. So different organizations have varying levels of cohesion. There's almost always ideological debates going on. Even in seemingly cohesive groups, there's at least some grumbling among the foot soldiers, or talking in private among some of the leadership about ways they might change things. The Frente Sandinista in Nicaragua actually has these three tendencies, they call them, the tendencias, that some see as almost three different organizations during a period in the mid-1970s. These all maintain a lot of the same core ideological principles. They differed based on what strategy they thought was best to win the war. Is it prolonged people's war? We're out in the mountains. Is it proletarian revolution? We're organizing the workers and the peasants, or is it this third way where we try to mobilize the whole population with a somewhat more moderate program, so that then we can put our socialist principles into place more after victory? And so in many ways, maybe they weren't so cohesive, but they had enough of a shared ideological grounding to keep them drawn together. And I think you see cohesion to a pretty strong degree across all three of these cases in Liberia, in Nicaragua, and Uganda. In Liberia, it's cohesion that is enforced coercively and through purging by Thaler, but he maintains this pretty cohesive organization. In the NRM in Uganda, it's also relatively cohesive, and so I think you can have different ideologies all result in cohesive organization and different state building outcomes. What happens to wartime institutions, and how do they carry over if groups' ideologies are evolving? With a case like HTS, their ideology was evolving to a degree, and what they were expressing before victory. So, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the last few years, is very different from its roots, and so, I would say the more recent iteration is the ideology that brought it to victory. Some of the more cooperative elements of its engagement with at least parts of the population, and its approach to institutions in parts of the country where it had influence, are ones that are likely to have some stickiness. Obviously, there are changing international pressures and incentives now, and there's also questions among some Syrian analysts and people who know the case way better than me about, how much has the group really changed, or was this just a play to get Turkish help and avoid immediately being attacked by other countries? So, I think wartime institutions are still likely to stick around. Rebecca Tapscott has some really good work on this in the Ugandan case, along with Nelson Casper, his earlier work about how some of these local governance institutions that were never part of the NRM's initial vision and program that they develop as part of their rebellion become the institutional basis for their governing system once they were in power. Their ideology stayed relatively the same. It was the particular political institutions they used to put it into practice. So I think you can, even when international pressures change or domestic pressures, wartime institutions are likely to have some stickiness there, at least for a while.
we're in time, but I want to first of all thank Gina for putting this all together on Rose's day off. And thank Justine Davis for a terrific set of comments to kick us off. And first of all, thank Kai Thaler for coming all this way and talking about his fabulous new book. So thanks everyone for coming out.
Thank you all.